Buenas noches, good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Malta Moreno Vega. I'm founder and creator of the Caribbean Justice Initiative, a creative justice initiative. As we have done in the past, we're having a conversation, and the conversation is looking at 100 days of Biden and Harris, now 100 and plus, and what it means for brown and black communities. And as we have done previously, we are talking with friends. We're talking in our living rooms. Eventually, we will come together and have these conversations actual. But right now, they're virtual because of the conditions that we're still in. And we need to protect ourselves. And one of the things that has been of concern to me as I read the news, as I look at TV, as I look at the media, there's this conversation and this narrative that is confusing, that is startling, that raises questions in terms of where we are now. With the change of administration, we're seeing, in my opinion, some very positive actions. COVID-19 seems to be getting under control. People are being vaccinated. People are following health rules in order to survive. And at the same time, there seems to be a calming of the narrative from government, right? That tells us and makes us feel that things are moving forward. But then I hear another narrative, a narrative that saw the height of itself January 6th. That narrative to me indicated that we're in a civil war, a race war, and what it means for brown and black bodies. We're also a year out from George Floyd, where we felt that the nation was outraged at what happened. We were all outraged because we have children. And in the protection of our children, that was an outrageous act. And we see action on it. But at the same time, we see more young people being killed. And it frightens me. I'm the mother of 2 sons. I have a nephew. And I'm the grandmother of 2 daughters, all right, that are also at risk. So what does that mean for us? So I felt that it was very important to bring people I love, people I trust, people who think about these issues in ways that are informative, help us think further on issues that we haven't thought about. And clearly, one of the issues that is becoming very obvious is the involvement of the Christian evangelical movement in politics. And, you know, the myth is that government and church are separate, but increasingly you're seeing a narrative of weaving them together in ways and actions that are frightening. So that I brought together friends and to have this conversation in our living room. So let me introduce you to Carl Rodney, who we go back with the creation of the Caribbean Cultural Center more than 42 years ago, right? And Carl, Cliff Lashley, and Rex Nettleford came to me and said, as I was developing the center when I was 2, that I could not develop it without learning the work of Rex Nettleford and being part of his teaching, right? And learning from him. And he became a mentor to the Caribbean Cultural Center and the staff. So Carl Rodney, thank you for being with us. Jonathan Soto is a young man that I met thanks to Samuel Cruz, who's a young activist and a thinker of faith, right? And has dedicated his work not only to policy, but also to looking at faith-based traditions and how they function within our communities. You have met Rosa Clemente, who's my, if I had a daughter, it would be Rosa Clemente. She's my baby, so that I claim her proudly as I seen her grow from college to the young, powerful woman she is today. And another one of the babies is Luvuma Bendele, who, as at a young age of about 15, came to the Caribbean Cultural Center and is a powerful leader within our community, nationally and internationally. So thank you all for sharing your time and being part of this conversation. And I'd like to add that Esmeralda Simmons is having problems signing on, but she will be joining us hopefully if she can navigate herself through technology. So one of the things I'd like to start with is, where are we? Where do you think we are? Right? Where do you think we are right now? With this sort of double-edged narrative that is both healing on one hand and frightening on the other. So can we start with you, Carl? Because I think the press is under attack, we know. And what does that mean for Caribbean people, African descendants today?
Sure. Well, it's a delight being with you, Martha, and all the years of work you have done to enlighten and embolden our community. It's just good to see that you're still on the job doing great work. I'm Carl Rodney. We publish Carib News. It's a weekly newspaper. We've been publishing now for 39 years. So I met Martha when I was president of the Jamaica Progressive League, another organization that I headed. And so we've been publishing Carib News for 39 years, as I mentioned. And we've also organized a multinational business conference in the Caribbean for the past 26 years. So we've had some perspective on what's happening, and we look at things in two ways. One, as it impacts our community here, and how we navigate uh, in the United States, how we become a part of the larger story, the greater um, majority, and then how we translate that to benefit the region, the Caribbean region, where we have particular interest in. But we also look at what Andrew Young called the Golden Triangle, where it's the North America, Africa, and the Caribbean. So that's how we have to look at things, because that's where we see our future, and that's how we want to be able to navigate our community. And Martha is right. Without a voice, nobody will hear you. And so we, as a media outlet, uh, want to make sure that our voice is clear and distinct for our community. And we're telling our own story. The motto of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, we want to plead our cause. And we want to look at things not just in the short term, long term, and we also want to be able to connect between what has been and how we project going forward. So, having said that, there's a lot of noise in the media area, a lot of noise, and a lot of it has very little to do with the truth, and has very little to do with how our community is viewed and who is telling our story and who is pleading our cause. For instance, in New York, we have no black owned radio. You have no black owned TV. And I'm heading an alliance now that is a combination of 9 black owned newspapers. And you might hear the notion they're community newspapers. Rupert Murdoch came in and bought 14 community papers in the New York area. So that's, while he has exited the market, that is not us. It's just not us. And so we have the effort to on the sea report and organize and advocate for people, keep us connected. But we also need to be able to see how we survive and how we keep in step with what's happening from a media and communication standpoint. Uh, it is critical and so important. Martha, you outlined the issues with respect to the Biden administration, and certainly how we need to be looking at it. as a people. But we're not going to get anywhere if we have to depend on CNN, MSNBC, or the New York Times. And the quicker we come to that realization and understand that with all this noise, we need to have our own media, we have to feed our own cause, is when we can start making stride as a people, protect our community, and develop as a society. And so, if I can contribute to this discussion, certainly it would be along the line of how we can then organize ourselves that we can be heard, and not only heard, but that we can be effective and be trusted and have a place in the decision making process.
Rosa, why don't you chime in terms of what you've been doing as an independent reporter and journalist in these times to get the voice out, right? To get the news out, to get our perspective out.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really been on the ground, since COVID started for so many reasons, especially like, medical and safety reasons. And so this last 14 months, I spent finishing up uh, my role as associate producer on Judas and the Black Messiah, which is interesting because today Amazon just bought MGM Entertainment.
Right.
So as much as particularly corporate media and conglomerates embrace Black Lives Matter last year, it was definitely, not about embracing Black Lives Matter as much as them realizing how they would have to adjust, because you did have a whole summer where these millions of people, it was on the news every day along with COVID, so in that way, I think that's why there's more consolidation happening. And local news, that's happening too, where they're beginning to buy, like a couple other conservative media conglomerates are buying up local news. And you could literally see the shift between like 1 week to the next of how they're reporting things. The flip side of it is that there is a lot of content out there from a younger generation my age. There are like nightly shows happening, podcasts, particularly YouTube shows. Even if we don't all agree with some of the information, there's a lot of people that are making media. I just don't think we're in sync with each other. I think there's a lot of duplication. And I still think with that, we're missing like critical voices, especially those people who have different abilities. And lastly, young people in general have no trust in anything, right? They don't trust institutions, politicians, high visible leaders, media. They don't trust that right now. But if there's no political education, which media has to be part of that, then we have young people who know they have to be out there. But at the end, if it's not organized, whether media or the grassroots, I think we're heading in a very bad situation, given the fact that we now know these extremists are definitely planning something. Um, they're becoming more emboldened in our communities to perpetuate violence. And look at all the deaths that we've seen since Derek Chauvin got convicted. I think we have to like analyze that, and massive political education is necessary.
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to be concerned about is how we use words and how we define who we are and who they are, right? Because I was talking before you came on about Black identity extremists, as the FBI wrote a report on 2017 when we were, sort of becoming aware of these attacks on culture and these attacks on activities, right, that identified us. Exactly what Carl is talking about, right? If we're talking about our own media, if we're talking about our own radio system, which we have been talking about and trying to maintain since the beginning of our being here, right? The reality is that we're being labeled, right, Black identity extremists. So who are the extremists? So we are the extremists because right now the project of 1619 is being attacked. It was attacked by the president, former president. It's attacked by McConnell, right? Radical race theory is being shut down in every way. It's almost like you're criminal if you're a scholar. So what are we saying? And how are we seeing these things, right? Because we are all culturally centered. We are all culturally centered. We're all cultural builders.
Can I just add something?
And that is being seen as a negative, right? That's being seen as being an extremist. That's being eyed and reviewed by the FBI and so on and so forth. And now coming out of the mouth of elected officials. So I saw you shaking your head, Lubumba, when Carl was talking. You want to comment?
Yeah, I want to just have Rosa finish her statement because I wanted to follow up with that.
Oh, she had finished. I'm sorry, Rosa.
Oh, no, because I heard y'all before we all went live. So last September, I had a speaking engagement with the National Credit Union, the federal governmental body over the credit union that falls under the FCC. And at that time, Trump's appointee, Rodney Hood, was heading it up. And 2 hours before I was set to speak for Hispanic Heritage Month, they called me and said they were canceling the event because Rodney Hood's people had done their background information on me and were like,
a Google search.
The tip of I was so hard to find, right? And I was like, oh man, this is happening, right? Like, of course it's always happened, but in that regard, and whatever, it got canceled, but to see this attack, I think some of us have also now have to face, especially when we believe that Palestinians have a right to return and are human beings that should not be under the genocide and the war against them. The last 3 gigs I did, everyone asked me specifically not to talk about Palestine. And I was like, okay, well, then I either do or don't, or you can cancel. And one person canceled. So, so I think individually, we're probably all leaders in our community. And at some point, we're beginning to face that. Even though we've been facing the Palestinian issue and how that can so get you canceled, the rapid succession they're going at is to keep silencing our voices as well, whether we're creating media or organizing artists and all of that.
Yeah, I agree. And, I'm actually going to take it from a different perspective. I think that when I look at this, particularly from a historical context, I look at it as in the context of a pendulum, going back and forth. And this idea that this entrenched far-right conservative force that we're seeing, I think, is in response to some of the victories that our people have won. So when we talk about nationally that there is a conversation, this was a framing, in fact, of the presidential debate around defunding the police. That was not a conversational piece just a year and a half ago. And so when we're dealing with that, and when we're dealing with also the idea that people are now, in a performative and almost, insulting kind of manner, raising and saying Black Lives Matter when just 2 years ago they wouldn't be caught dead saying those words. Again, I think we're looking at it a response to the potential kind of momentum that we can continue to build. And so while we are looking at the really frightening positions that I'm seeing, I'm looking at that from the context of them being afraid. I'm looking at that from the context of them recognizing that things that have happened previously will not continue to just happen as they have been. So we're looking at, just last year, the New York Times said that the movement we saw over the summer was the largest movement in U.S. history, largest protest movement in U.S. history. Over 25 million people were protesting in the summer. That had never happened in this country before. So we're seeing a response to that reality. And that response is, we ain't going nowhere, we're going to fight. And so I think that while it's frightening because we're advancing. And we may not be advancing in policies. We may not be advancing in terms of institutional steps. But I think in terms of ideology, I think in terms of consciousness, we're advancing. And I think it's important to raise that so that we don't get beat down with the apathy, which is easy to do when we look at everything that's happening, but to put it in the context that we're winning. And we have certainly a whole lot more to do, but we are moving forward. There's so much that has happened that I would not have dreamed would have happened. The work that I do around political prisoners, I think over the past 4 years, we've looked at about maybe 10 people who were sentenced to die in prison are now home. These are radical people who come out of the Black Liberation Army, the Black Panther Party, MOVE, who were told that they would not see the light of day. They're home with their families. So I think, those things help me understand that we're making some advances, and that we need to really make sure that we don't fall into this apathy quicksand, but to recognize that we are making some advances, and we have to keep doing it in order to push back and fight back on this far right conservative kind of a wave that still exists and is fighting back hard as well.
Well, I think that yes, and then you hear that across the nation, right? Mm-hmm. There's a movement to suppress our vote.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Legally. Mm-hmm. It's not legally. By the courts are saying they're going to limit our vote.
Yeah.
Right? And Carl and I were talking earlier, right? If you really talk about it, we're the numerical majority in this country.
Right.
Because my students and everyone I speak to, and I hear the word minority, I said, stop right there. Stop right there with this BIPOC conversation, because we keep minimalizing who we are in numbers and in possibility. But at the same time, we can't deny, right, that the court system has been now rigged.
Right.
To prevent the vote, where we brought out masses in Atlanta, Stacey
Abrams.
Abrams is amazing. I mean, she's my shero, right?
Yeah,
they're suppressing the vote.
Right, and that's still, I think, along the lines of this far right kind of wave, because attached to that also, we're looking at a number of different states that have enacted these anti-protest laws. So now, what they're really essentially trying to do is prevent another 2020 summer from happening again. Right. And so we're seeing all of that that's happening. And I do think that we're going to see, well, let me say this. I know on the ground there's going to be a significant amount of pushback. I think this is a really solid litmus test for those civil rights organizations, particularly those civil rights law institutions, to step up and see if you're really about the business of protecting civil rights for people of color, for Black folks particularly, because this is the way, this is your time. This is your time. You need to be in court every single day until those laws are beat back. You need to be in court every single day until those voting rights laws are beaten back. All of those things are mandates for these same civil rights institutions that profited. And let me say this real clearly. That profited from the summer of 2020 when philanthropy started throwing money at Black institutions. People talk about BLM, but if you want to ask real questions, ask how much the major civil rights institutions raked in. Ask how much they have gotten. So they have a responsibility to step up and do what they're claiming is their space to occupy. They have to.
Well, I hear you, because I get communication from ACLU, right? And supporting it and doing what I can from my corner, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm not hearing from anybody else.
That's right.
I'm hearing from us, but I'm not hearing from what the organizations you're talking about. How do we hold people accountable?
That's right.
Right? And it's our responsibility to hold them accountable. That's right? Because in essence, the question and the purpose of this discussion with friends is to say, well, where do we go from here? What's the next step? right? Last summer was last summer. Powerful, amazing, historic. But we're a year later, right? The bill for in honor of Floyd hasn't passed as yet, right? So where are we, and where are we going, and what are the directions that we need to be thinking about? Because there's another factor, and this is where Jonathan comes in, and this is our conversation yesterday, Jonathan. The presence of evangelicals in swaying the political climate, right? And how they're swaying it has a lot to do with suppressing culture, right? Because, I mean, I've heard stories in Puerto Rico, for example, you know, they'll see people in the religions will see a gigante and say that's the devil, when that is historically an African image that has survived within our communities. So it's also an attack on culture, right? This movement. So if you could speak on it some, that would be helpful as I get a light on.
Sure. And I think what we see in the understanding of, I think people talked about the media here and also the religious space as spaces that function as creators of myth, right? So the media creates myth that we engage with and engage with civically, and we buy into those myths like American exception, like pull yourself up through your bootstraps, like all these different like neoliberal alienating concepts that push us. And in many cases, religion has formed that part, especially in our settler colonial, like anti-Black, white supremacist country, right? That's the founding, the settler colonial state. And, you know, James Baldwin said it's best that religion sanctifies power, right? The function of religion under white supremacist hold is to sanctify the use of power from whatever is the myth-making entity, whether it's the press, whether it's the religious institutions, or whether it's our government. It all serves as a way of finding different ways of engaging there. And I think if we look at this really interesting way of white supremacy wrapping itself under blue-collar, working-class rhetoric under Trump, which is ideologically inconsistent, right? Trump as the biggest globalist crime network, but talking against trade, giving subsidies to farmers, and really took the kind of evangelical, I would say, fetishizing of one of the things they do is, if we can't get there, we're going to shut everything down. We're going to usher in the apocalypse, and we're going to make sure that this country cannot be used for anyone else if it's not for us. And that's a function of dominionism, which is a function of white supremacy in many religious movements, whether they're adopted in different countries, where it's either all or nothing. It's very monotheistic, and it's a cleansing agent for power and supremacy. And in the United States, it represents itself in that function, in that form. So we see 89% of white evangelicals supporting Trump. However, you see a lot of Latina folks also supporting Trump in that way, because many of them come into the working class through the military-industrial complex, where we see, whether it's being a cop or you enter into the working class or middle class, you know, as a Puerto Rican that can't get access to a job in the island, you join the military, and you see the military kind of promotion that's happening there. It's very similar whether in Puerto Rico or in Palestine, as we see the increasing use of faith, right? So Israel is the government of Israel is an ethno-fascist religious state, right? That's exactly its function in many ways, and making a distinction between the government, between the state, and between Jewish people. But as Rosa mentioned, it's very controversial to make even hints at that because one of the things white supremacy tries to do is protect that myth. And I think earlier this week, Ta-Nehisi Coates had talked a bit about the myth of whiteness sanctifying and cleansing the action of the rioters in the Capitol. That myth allowed for an inversion of the police to literally attack the entity that gave it power, right? It's an interesting dialectic and inversion of sorts. that goes for the perpetuation of white supremacy. So I think that what happens is, and what the way it functions with working people, with poor people, those that attach themselves to white evangelicalism, is that it's literally an opiate, right? It makes you hate and detest this present life. It is an anti-life ideology, and it pushes all of your freedom and your gift at the end in the clouds after you've given your entire life for the cause of capital and white supremacy in this country. So we see people very happily go and become QAnon conspiracists and want a nuclear war because for some reason that'll start a Middle Eastern conflict where, you know, the second coming of Christ will spark Armageddon. And you see the fascistic, militaristic, and really annihilating impact that we see that religion functions in many ways, specifically in America through this fetishization. So I think it's really important to also think about religion as a function of mass psychology, really. You know, I know people view religion in different ways. I'm talking more about spirituality and how our entities, you go on to Fox News every day, right? Like there's always a story about an aggrieved baker that couldn't serve a queer person, or an anti-mask. I mean, anti-masking is the most anti-life thing that we've ever seen, and it was the evangelical white and a lot of Latino, Latinx folks, and in many places in every community, right? Because white supremacy finds a way to tokenize in different spaces. So you have Florida pastor burning masks because the blood of Jesus is sufficient, right? And it's ushered in the most anti-death and anti-life movement or occurrence in this history, what with over 600,000 deaths, many, you know, happening because of this. So it's really unfortunate that that religion gets to find a way to avoid criticism, because I think one of the things that a lot of, you know, rationalists, materialists, and a lot of folks in academia and liberal spaces, they kind of view religion as something from the past that's no longer playing an animating force in white supremacy.
But it's very obvious that it's playing, you know, a significant role in what is happening now, right? It's very obvious. I mean, when the former president comes out with a Bible, right, and holds it upside down, whatever that signifies, and whatever example that goes back historically, right? It is putting a book that is seen as sacred at the center of who we are, of what the nation is, right? And the conversations that we're seeing coming out of people putting the word God in conversations, right? It is also a signal of what it means, right? Because what God are we talking about? What does he look like? What is that color, right? Why isn't it she as the goddess? You know, all of that. It gets complicated, but what it does is it identify how people are defining themselves and defining the country, right? And when we start seeing culture and Black culture as being part of an extremist identity, right? And we, you know, and I'm older, Carl and I go back right to the 70s and so on, when fighting for our curriculums, just having Puerto Rican history, right? A Puerto Rican department, a Black department, a Caribbean department at universities was an oddity, right? We had to fight for that. And now it's being called, you know, it's being called. The 1619 Project is being called. And then what you're seeing also is that this brilliant journalist is not given tenure. So that talks about how the educational process is complicit, right? It's totally complicit in the education of our community. So where do we go from here? It goes back to the question.
Mr. Rodney, I think you're on mute.
I think we have to be clear that so you have the white supremacists, you have a number of the religious group and what have you that are at us, but you have to look at that the mainstream political system, the Republicans, they are passing these suppression bill in 43 states. I mean, it's not a fringe element or it's not a extreme element. This is a normal stream of the politics in the United States, and that is happening. And to my friend Lamumba, I mean, these organizations that are funded to raise these cases in the courts, they're outnumbered. I mean, you're looking at the kind of force that we need to recognize that this what we're looking to face down is a mainstream Republican effort, and it's organized, and there's no counter, absolutely no counter to the left that would push us anywhere, uh, push them anywhere out, because everything has been going more right as a full effort. And so we need to talk about the courts, we need to talk about the extreme group, but what is happening is there in governance in 43 states, the suppression of black and brown vote is a policy of the Republican Party. We have to understand that, and then we have to organize around that, because as Martha and I were talking earlier, you got to have a short-term strategy and you have to have a long-term strategy. And Rosa says, well, young people not into some of these things and what have you. They gotta be in, because youth is just a transitional period, as Rex would say. You gotta see what is in it for the future, where we're going, and what is the big battle. And the big battle is how we are going to organize and survive the people around a political party that is a part of the system centuries and has now shifted to suppressors. And that's what we have to deal with. And we have to be very serious about it. And we can't be around the fringes. We got to get a way to confront it fully and understand that is the battle.
I agree. I agree with what I was saying about young people is they don't have trusted institution organizations, not that they haven't been out there. But I do agree with your premise, which would make me disagree both with Lumumba and Maita. And it doesn't, I don't get any pleasure out of saying this, but I don't think we're advancing at all. Advancing to what? I think what we're missing in this conversation is geographical location. What could be advancement in the big cities, which we are seeing. But we're also seeing that police are now going to be funded even more money. Even this act with the George Floyd, bandholds are already choked. They have cameras. That's all the movement won. Unfortunately, years were body cameras, and it doesn't matter. And I'm saying that's an egregious part of what's happening. But also, both parties are, I think almost equally complicit. And this is what I mean. I'm here in Albany and all the way to Buffalo. Every one of these small towns is mostly run some by Democrats, and they're always Black. So here in Albany, we have a Black police chief, a Black human rights commissioner, a Black speaker, white Irish woman mayor, and a Black DA. They have been the most horrible and oppressive policing that I have seen ever. We've had 12 shootings in a city of less than 100,000 people in 4 days. Their response is tanks tonight rolling through the community, tear gas, pepper spray for those that just went 2 hours ago to protest in front of the police station. Same thing with Rochester. The Rochester mayor And everyone that was Black under her covered up the murder of Daniel Perdue. Her husband just got arrested for trafficking drugs and selling guns in the street. So for me, I don't think we're advancing in the way that it's seen throughout the country. I think there's some places that have been advancing. So I think some things, but I also think it requires us to be okay with saying most movements are 7 and 9 years. We all study social justice movements. You're talking about 7 and 9 years. We're 7 years into what we could call the Black Lives Matter historical era. And has there been advancement? I think in terms of the way young people are, even with mental health stuff, they're unapologetically embracing their Blackness, what that means, what it means to be queer, what it means not to just follow anybody. I think those things are important. But we have to come to a point where we're like, it's okay. Maybe what worked 7 years ago, won't work now. How do we reassess? How do we not be dependent on the two-party system? How don't we not be dependent on the courts? And I think for me, the thing that definitely is like, okay, you can look at this and analyze it and disagree with some folks. But also, I think the best thing that I've seen coming out of last summer is that there are young people that are ready to be organized. And I think our organizations have to make some major shifts where we really take, in my generation particularly, really start training young people. Like, we shouldn't be in leadership positions anymore per se. Like, I feel that, and I never thought I'd be the person that say that, but I think it requires my generation to be like, yo, we're not mentoring a lot of these young people. What does it mean, again, to have a circle of political education? What does it mean for those of us as academics to realize we're never going to be safe in academia? Our departments are getting cut the most. All these state colleges are rolling back budgets, and they're cutting counselors, they're cutting like student organizations, vice presidents of diversity. Those positions are being cut. Tenure is being taken away. And like you all brought up, and I think this is important too, how does Dr. Cornell West and Hannah Nicole Jones don't get tenure? What do you like? So for people like me, you're like, academia is not even a safe space for us to at least be who we are as organizers, professors, activists, cultural workers, and all of that. So again, I come from a geographical space that I don't have the energy that I do see in Oakland, New York, Minneapolis, bigger cities. So I think it just has opened up my eyes, lastly, to until we deal with the contradiction in our community, until we're really ready to have a conversation about some of us having privilege, which it includes me, and prepare for the end of this year when we could be seeing a wave of mass evictions into like 3, 4, 5 million people. Because when this rent moratorium is up, all these landlords are going to want everything. And they're using the courts. I think if anything, yes, let's fight some of this stuff around critical race theory and all of that. But let's get these organizations like Lumumba, let's push them to be in the courts over all these impending convictions, which is going to heighten the inequity, then the complete militarization of our communities by the police, because they're going to try to control even people out here fighting for equity and end to capitalism. That's what they're preparing for. So with that, I would agree with y'all in that sense. We've advanced a little because we know now what we should be doing and what we could do better. I know that was long. I won't talk anymore, but I really needed to suss it out just because I am like dislocated from big cities where y'all are at. Yeah. So we don't have community like this up here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Jonathan, what are you seeing? Because I know you're in around sort of political scenes, right? And what are you hearing about future steps? In a very broad sense.
Yeah, especially spending a lot of time, as I mentioned, in different activist spaces. And I think also thinking about crises as events that are disrupting people, are changing their material conditions, and showing how the state is failing, whether that was, as we mentioned, police violence in America, COVID, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, right? All these types of crises are everywhere. And I think one of the things that's happening on the ground is we're seeing a lot of work of understanding, like mutual aid groups, people understanding the state is not coming to their rescue. Therefore, how do people come together? And I think what Rosa mentioned is critically important. But a lot of these associations have been happening virtually here during COVID, whereas like in Puerto Rico, I saw a lot of them happening in person. Because of the hurricane, it just immediately eliminated all access to electricity. So I think there's something about the spaces where we're organizing in, and how they could either alienate or create relationships of solidarity based on these crises. So here in New York City, we've seen a lot of mutual aid works coming up, but again, we're in political campaign season, and we've seen the appropriation of a lot of these movements to subvert them for political ends of people that are not representative of the community. And we also see the nonprofit like industrial complex coming closer to a lot of these mutual aid groups, leveraging a lot of the political capital that exists on the ground in exchange for a grant, which I'm sure happens in every space, whether it's in the art space and in this space that's emerging. So I think it is definitely nuanced. And I think the practice, at least my practice, and it's more of a spiritual practice, is how do we find to address people's material conditions right now? Rosa mentioned the people disenchanted by politics because it's promises delayed time and time again. For the case of many, and people are literally died, 600,000 people in this country, and I think we're starting to see different approaches to that. But I think we've seen amazing mutual ground up networks meeting people's material needs, but we've also seen the threat of co-option by a lot of systems that are trying to reinvent themselves for a post-COVID world.
So, what are you seeing as steps? Or, steps. So what do you see as things that we should be thinking about as steps moving forward?
So I think some of the things that I've been pondering is trying to figure out how we deal with, as an organizer, some of our prayers being answered. What do I mean? For decades, we had been, working towards praying for and trying to get masses of people to become activated, right? We have that now. We have that now. So we actually have, I think, the flip side of a different kind of dynamic where now New York City has so many different new younger organizations. Like, I don't know who they are, right? And so how do we need to close these gaps? There are so many different organizations that are doing electoral work now that this organically grew. And so I think the challenge that we have is for those folks who have been doing this work for decades, how do we bridge this gap? How do we make sure that these newer organizations, many of whom are, I think, an organic representation of what this moment has produced, but are looking for some kind of political anchor, are looking for direction, and many of them explicitly said that. But how do we find this? How do we find them, number one, and create a real humble process, in fact, to be able to share collectively? Because I don't think we're going to go into spaces and saying this is how you need to do what you do. No, we need to be able to share, hey, this is what we did, this is what worked, this is what didn't work. How can we support you? How can we support you? Some of the best mentors that I've had that I respect still to this day were the ones who came to me as a young organizer and said, what do you need me to do? And these are the people that were kicking ass as teenagers themselves. And so for them to be able to say and recognize that there's a new wave of leadership, there's a new wave of activism, what do you need me to do? How do I plug in? How do I support? Those kinds of things. I think that's the sort of the new kind of dynamic that we're dealing with. And Jonathan, I think you're absolutely correct. Some of the things I think that have remained from last year that I think has just been a godsend are the mutual aid networks. The fact that we saw them save lives during the pandemic and people are still being able to utilize them in different ways, like those are really important opportunities that we need to begin to support, find out how we can advance them, how do we can, help them become more effective. So I think there's a lot that's happening, but at the end of the day, we cannot escape the necessity of organizing. We cannot escape the necessity of doing what we can, where we are with what we have, and we see people doing that, and we have to figure out how we're going to support that, how we're going to be more effective with what we're doing, and quite frankly, save our lives.
Can I comment on that, Lumumba, in terms of the number of organization, activist organization, and people with a purpose? And you're saying there need to be a platform to collect and share, and that's the only way we're going to be able to move and manage the movement. But for me, in the media and communication world, we have to find that platform to make that happen. Because when you look at the um, influence of Google and Facebook and what have you, I mean, they're driving, making things happen. They're driving the information. And where we need to start thinking about what platform there is, or we need to create, or we need to organize around sharing this information, consolidating the information, and in a position to use the technology, really use the technology to advance our cause. We are far beyond the fax machine and emails and that. No, we're in an age where we, as a people, as people of color, and we have the greatest advantage if we start connecting that way globally. And my sense is that we're not preparing ourselves for that move into a, a digital platform where we have our own space, we can share, we can move, we can organize, and we can own it. We can own it, and we can manage it. I think in the long term, if we don't have that, we'll be renting information space that we'll never control.
Mhm.
And they can do as they feel like, and they'll throw you. Google is throwing all kinds of money at media, black media, or they say minority media. But what do you do? What can you do when your content is controlled by these people? So I think all of what is being said is very important. We need to organize, we need to be aware, we need to look at the courts, we need to look at, but at some place there has to be a gathering of this information and a way to make it effective and productive. And I think with the noise, and I know Rosa said there are lots of media out there and lots of good media, but we've got to find a way to pull that all together and make it work, because otherwise it's being dismissed and it's being diffused. And so I think we have to have some long-term um, position goal to find a, a path on technology that gives us a voice, gives us a that we can be heard, and that we can also be our own cause, and that will make uh, will make improvement here and there, but we'll still be at the mercy of communication and information that we don't control.
Yeah, that's my step. There is no reason any organization has gotten millions of dollars and we don't have one TV studio in the United States of America. That's crazy to me.
Crazy.
I mean, I've been that person in the circle of my friends for such a long time. And then I realized, I'm like, there must be some issue of trust that won't allow people to think outside of like social media and tweeting and Facebooking. All they have completely changed every algorithm at this point. And I do think I've seen definitely better, younger, savvier news coming from the international world. And I'm like, what would it look like if we finally had reporters who were on the ground in Chile, where they're rewriting the constitution of the country, in Colombia, where we've never seen an uprising from Afro-Colombians of this magnitude, even in Palestine.
In
They
Haiti.
didn't erase any,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's, and why then, this was me last week or 2 weeks ago, when Israel bombed a media site, knowing there were journalists, I'm like, we have to create something within that can bridge our different ways of getting to freedom. And what that means, like, to have actual information and news shared. I don't get why we haven't done that yet. And you're right, there are so many good shows out there, but we need the hub for them. And that requires millions. It's going to require millions.
Well, most of our population is in the States is Caribbean, right? And that's the importance of Carl and Carib News. I mean, we have not, right? Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, right? Has not connected to the rest of the Caribbean in terms of issues and in terms of understanding our Blackness and the power of the numbers, right? Of us is here, as well as connecting to our root cultures. So, you know, what is that platform, you know, that Carl is addressing to, right? As well as Lubumba is addressing to. Maybe the platform is not even within the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And I'm
Right?
wondering, and I think we may need to just broaden our expectations, and it may not be one platform. I think this idea of consolidating it to one platform may be a little bit too ambitious. I think the way things are so siloed, like, is there a model that can be replicated so that people can actually be able to go to different places and be able to get, be a central location of information? So,
they exist.
Well, Jonathan was dealing with that when we were speaking, right? Because I hadn't even thought about it, because I'm not into Christianity and so on. But when he talked about what the role of the missionary is, right? I wish you could talk some on that, Jonathan, because that's a system of organizing, right? That's a system of getting the word out. Did you hear me?
Yeah, he's on mute, Jonathan.
Sorry about that. Yeah, they definitely had a message that many found compelling. It was, here's the Bible or the sword, and that's exactly, or disease, right? That's really what they did. But I think it was the impulse. And I think one of the things mentioned here, very important, we have lots of platforms for consumption as opposed to platforms for creation. And that's a key thing, I think, that has to shape like our epistemology, our way of being in the world. Like, how do we move from a consumption-based society, one that's structured of us like buying into the white ethno state of America being great and just consuming everything, because it turns you passive, right? In an existential way, it makes you passive. But to create, to affirm, is something that's missing. And I think, right, when lots of people talk about abolition or defund the police, as Ruth Gilmore Wilson says, abolition is not an absence but a presence. So what are we bringing into this world? And I think also when we talk about ownership, collective ownership, as mentioned, systems in nature move on and are most likely to avoid catastrophe if they're heterogeneous, right? If there's many different nodes of power that are in different spaces, it becomes more difficult to wipe out someone if we see power in different places that are centered in a non-hierarchical way. Centralizing access, but and I think about it as like cooperative autonomy, right? How do we cooperate based on shared like resources that are provided to us because these are human rights, and we have a system of reparations that acknowledges the distribution of those resources, but also how do we love for the autonomous process of creation? And right, creation, whether you're an artist or whether you're an activist, it stems from the individual experience, but it's collectively appreciated, right? So what healing value, what function does it have to the regeneration and restoration of our society? So media that could do that, I think that's a challenge, but it's definitely a challenge worth pursuing.
Well, I think that one of the things that we sort of need to do, and others have done it throughout, consciously and intentionally, like the Harlem Renaissance, right? The Negritude movement. There have been different cultural movements centered in connecting the diaspora, right? The African diaspora. And it has been cultural movements, but cultural movements of consciousness, right? And cultural movements of freedom. And how do we create that platform for the future, right? Centered in bridging our false borders, because we're all in the same place in the United States, yet we're sort of have isolated ourselves, right? In terms of Puerto Rican communities, Dominican communities, African American communities, and so on. So how do we bridge, right, that consciousness and that historical legacy? Because if we do, as I said at the beginning, with the numerical majority. And if anything, January 6th told us is the fear of a Black nation. And it is a Black nation. And we have to act and understand that it is. So how do we activate that creative platform using, Jonathan's terminology, right? Mm-hmm. And what Carl and Rosa and also Larumba saying, we have that access, right? We have those connections. They were, to look at the Negritude movement, to look at the Pan-Africanist movement. These are all movements that were very conscious about uniting us. And my question then becomes, is that happening now with what we're seeing?
Mm-hmm. When we were, Rosa was saying, while I was closing my statement, saying that those platforms exist. And I think it's important to hear that, because I think just as I am critical of people who say that there is no organized movement, my pushback is that our framing of what we're looking for and our concept of what organized movements look like has shifted. When we think of organized movement, we're looking for a preacher, a Black man, straight, but if we're looking for that, we're not going to find it, because the leadership, the organizers are, first of all, collectives, not individuals. And second, reflect trans communities, they're homeless, they're disabled people. And so all of those different identities that we would totally look past. So I'm wondering if that's the same kind of framing that I need to adjust in terms of looking for these media platforms, because I think we're looking for something, but it may not necessarily be with the framing that we are looking at. Or whatever it is, we need to find out what it is. And I also think attached to that, we need to really support, I think, the organic process of storytelling, and not just in terms of writing stories, but I'm talking about through theater, through song, through film, but being able to tell our stories, our experiences in that way, because we know the effectiveness of that. And while it may not be a traditional media platform or outlet, we do know the effectiveness of it. And how do we make sure we're supporting those organic processes as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
go ahead, Russell.
That's what I was going to say. We just need a hub. See, this is a thing. I want to be clear, because it's funny that every time people disagree with each other, we're all like, I get texts like, "Oh my God, you didn't agree," or somebody didn't agree with you. And it's like, that's something that we have to get back to. Like, how can we have principled, not arguments, principled dialogue? So for me, it's about taking what already exists, because if we're looking for all those multiple identities, they do exist in all different, more digital media spaces. So for me, it's like, basically, how do we create an HBO Max for our people, where some guidelines, but you can turn on that and we're going to hear about what's going on in the Caribbean. You could turn on that and we're going to see trans queer young people having a fashion show and being, about what it looks like to repurpose clothing and all that. Because young people, what they are coming with are the most kind of creative, innovative ideas I've seen. And not even my generation. We might have created hip hop, but what these young people are doing is they're interrogating everything and everybody. And I think that's important. And I think people are out there creating their hubs, their little spaces, but we just don't have a place where we kind of have a hub. And that would require some type of massive amount of buy-in from many organizations following some principles and coming up with the money, or what already kind of, I think it exists. What would it look like if we push nonprofits to finally fund like 100 groups to create that channel or that hub? That I know we have the power to do that, So
The technology exists,
Yeah.
and the model exists, and so and that is the future. You can't escape it, and so we need to, as you have said, Rosa, and it's not that um, it doesn't require that huge capital that we might talk about in terms of million, but it does require the consciousness that we can't be an outpost if we're going to make progress. We got to get in there, and we have to have our own platform. And I agree with Ilomoma. It doesn't have to be one, but the thing is, and the one has to be dynamic and accommodate a whole lot. But we know we are the gatekeepers to a large extent, and we're responsible for content and educating and covering storytelling. The spiritual, religious aspect of it. It all belongs to, and it's all global. And I'm just throwing out there because if we start thinking about where we ought to be, um, and if we don't have that means of communication, regardless of where we are and what we might be doing, we're just not going to be able to make that progress. So, my sense is that if we can point the way and say this is what needs to happen, here's where we're going. We certainly see where we are with Google and Facebook and Yahoo and what they're doing to our content, and we just need to be able to deal with it. So it's something that we need to, and something that I've been thinking about for a while, and we have organized. In fact, Martha, the National Black Publishers Association had not necessarily an agreement, but a coming together with the Hispanic Publishers Association around how we can start looking at this larger platform of information, not just our individual publication or individual websites and what have you, but how we can coordinate messages and some of it has to do with, of course, revenue. But so there's been some talk, and in this conversation, as we have thought leaders, I wanted to be sure to plant that as aspirational, but it certainly is. It's happening. Sirius FM, they're a collection of how you combine media and how you market it and how you can control and be effective. That we can look at, and it will be good to see that happening.
Well, I think that in the discussion, certain things have come up that are critical to sort of network and for us to continue talking about at some point offline, right? Because there's a certain level of organizing that you can do online, and of course there's another level that you can do offline. But I think that critical to what I'm hearing, at least, is that there needs to be a platform. And as Luvumba said, it may not look at like what we understand to be a platform, right? Because we represent different generations, and we need to hear what different generations are seeing as what that platform might be and what it might look like, right? Across disciplines, across genders, across, ideas, right? Of what a creative process of bringing us together looks like. And, as Jonathan has said, how do we focus on that creative way of organizing and spreading that organizing message out almost as missionaries, right? In terms of developing a level of consciousness that we agree upon, right? We may not agree on everything else, but we need to agree on certain things. And what those things might be is critical. Because as Carl, you said, across the nation, voting is being suppressed. So that's happening at the local and it's happening at the national level. Getting back to school for our children, the end of COVID is critical, right? So that the wonderful part of what we're hearing now through the media about this administration is that so many people have gotten vaccinated, and now younger people are getting vaccinated. So the possibility of opening in the near future seems right at some point. What does that initial coming together to develop a platform, and who and how do we get the widest participation of different ways of thinking and different ways of seeing it come together? And I think that thinking of local, national, and international ways of bridging, right, what the work is. And there I agree with, Lubumba. I mean, the impact of last year, and it continues, because throughout the communities that our people are, Black Lives Matter is an issue, is an embrace by our own communities. Other people are going to co-opt whatever, because they're going to co-opt it, right? But within our communities, it holds true. People are honoring it, are incorporating it in their way of being. And how then does that get nurtured even further, right? And how do we do that? And how do we think about it? Because to me, the moment is, and Lubumba addressed it before, democracy is being challenged in ways that is frightening. I think that's the initial call I made to everybody. It's frightening. And we have to think about it. And I understand that the everyday is hard, right? Because we have to worry about our children. We have to worry about the roof over our heads. But we also have to worry about whether we're going to live in a democracy or we're going to live in an autocracy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that can't be, shut down because we're facing problems every day. That's a thought we have to have. Why are people coming to this country, right? Because they see it as a way of freedom from, dictatorships and poor conditions in different parts of the world. So how are we not consciously going to protect the experiment, right? Because we understand that it's still an experiment, and we're part of that experiment, and we help build that experiment. So, what is our role in doing so? Mm-hmm. So we have some questions. Are you all up to answering some questions from our audience?
Let's do it.
So, Olga, let's do it.
There was one that was up there. Yeah, there we go.
Let's keep it short so we can do all of them.
Okay,
Right.
So one person take on a question, so we don't have to go round robin, and we can do as many as possible.
Yes, we're better off today in terms of the fact that we don't have thousands of people dying every day. That's the best part, that they did what they were supposed to do. And now we have to also figure out how we are equity with vaccines and how we integrate even that into our movements to make sure the rest of the world is not getting vaccines because of hoarding. But we're better off, I think.
Okay, so do we have another question, Olga? Hello, guys. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for this. Aside from an administrative changing, do you think that our dependence on organized religion has more to do with our current situation? That's a Jonathan question. That's for you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think it goes down to the word organized is the key word. And I think about a comment Kwame Ture made about organization versus mobilization. And I think that's a question and thing that we do a lot of, right? Our communities mobilize a lot, right? So it's like a specific goal as opposed to a long-term commitment to a mass project is organizing. Right. So I think that religion, for whatever way functions here, because it's protected by the government, literally, and we've seen the recent religious freedom laws in past cut against like indigenous people, right? So there's a Supreme Court state that prevented people that use peyote to use it in religious ceremony. And just recently, we saw right wingers use that very same law to allow them to bypass religious restrictions of mask uses, right? So I think that talks about how organized, well-funded, and common purpose that a lot of organized religion has in America. So I think that's been a reason why we've seen many of their successes electorally and successes, whether it's like the Tea Party movement or Bill Clinton centrism, or Ronald Reagan's attack on taxes and getting corporate, or Trump's just recent barrage. They always have an ally, which is white evangelicalism. And I think that to the extent that they're organized, we lose power if we're not organized ourselves. Because that's the way energy is moving. Energy moves to disciplined, organized social forces. So I do think that the media could play a large role in our culture and our collective psychology, as mentioned, if we are able to organize with media and not just mobilize, but organize.
Thank you, Jonathan. Do we have another question? That's a Lumumba question.
How can that generational gap that Lumumba was mentioning with elders not knowing what new younger generation movements are doing, how can we bridge that space? Honestly, I think it's about us getting out of our comfort zones, getting out of our spaces. One of the reasons I was able to identify what some of these new spaces look like was, being on the ground in Ferguson. When I went down there and there was all of these national conversations about these uprisings are just disorganized, lacking leadership. And of course, again, if you just looking with this particular lens, you're not going to see it. But being on the ground there, being able to see, homeless people literally coordinating these daily protests, people who left school, literally dropped out of college to just be out in the street and coordinate not just these protests, but also sustain some of the coordination of people coming in from all over the country. You actually have to be there. You need to actually leave your bubble. You need to be able to go and have conversations with people you don't typically have conversations with. And I think that when we start doing that, we'll begin to see things differently. It's not going to be, a very quick overnight thing, but I think that's part of, and in fact, I think that's what we need to be doing anyway. In order for us to be able to say that we have our finger on the pulse of what's happening. We got to step out of our comfort zone, step out of the spaces that we're familiar and comfortable with, and get in the streets with folks. It's not saying we need to do what they're doing, but we need to show up. We need to be supportive. We need to find out what's happening.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Because we're ready to wrap up. Is there a silence in some sections, especially the right to think that means the right is planning to attack the culture? Carl, you want to take that one?
I'm not too sure that there is a silence in some sector. especially the right. I don't know that that is necessary. So, um,
Exactly. They're very loud. They're
yeah,
very
they're very
loud.
loud. And there's no counter on the left. Do we think that means the right is planning to attack politically, culturally, and literally are they better planners than us? Well, the issue really, what do we have to come to the right? And then we do have a strong progressive movement now, to some degree, but the right has gone for decades now, since they killed the labor unions, of course, um, downgraded what was supposed to be a socialist movement in this country, and everything has been pushed right now rather than any pressure from the left. So the right is certainly not silent; they're very organized, and the left has not taken any steps recently. Even, you know, what we consider the most leftist of organization, the trade union, is very much not active. So I would suggest that the left needs to be far more active and provide more pressure that the right will give in some degree.
And let me just add and say, I think we need to always assume that the right is always planning, that they're always organizing. You know, that's what the Tea Party thing was about. You know, this whole Trump
Right.
brigade didn't just pop up overnight. This
Right.
was intentional, very effective organizing. As much as we don't want to admit it, this was very effective organizing.
Yeah.
And they still do, right? And
And
very funded.
they're recruiting now.
Yeah.
I had told Martha, watch this PBS documentary on American extremists. It's a series. The thing is, those people that are doing the series are organizers from back in the day, you know, who have now shifted to, you know, outing out. What they did effectively is they have their own media hub. They've been able to some crazy way with all the QAnon conspiracies, mainstream that in that particular demographic. And lastly, at the end, they outweapon us, right? They have the military might in a way behind them just by who they are, but also of, you know, the amount of guns and all that. But organizing tight can always still affect that, and that's why I think the left is completely falling apart. Might not be as organized, but at least we have to figure out a way to start breaking up their entire narrative. And
Jonathan, how does the Christianity and the evangelical movement tie into that in terms of organizing and having a loud voice, right? Because someone said like they're silent. Then I mean, you look at TV, that's the voice. That's the voice you're hearing. You know, we're not hearing the left.
Yeah, they're loud, and I think they mirror a lot of what movements called now as accelerationism, especially in times of crises. We saw, for example, this idea in white supremacist angle is if we accelerate crisis, if we go to protests and ourselves like bring guns, what we saw with Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Actually provoke confrontation. We're going to accelerate the crisis, and they believe, as Rosa mentioned, that since they have the most guns, if we go into a civil war, they'll be able to exterminate people, right, in cities that maybe don't have as free gun laws. It's very interesting to see how they frame it and what the religious right does. In many ways, it sanctions, it sanctifies a lot of these actions. It finds way to say, even though you literally ransacked and attacked the Capitol, you know, for whatever reason, you saw the media writing about, oh, this was an all-state farm agent, this was a gardener, this was like, it's the normalizing of this radical commitment, which I think is even more dangerous because they you know, criminality, especially as defined in our criminal justice system, injustice system, in and of itself is a way of creating different classes. And right, you don't see much criminality attributed to the rioters of January 6th in the media. The framing is always about a normal person that felt lost in their country, right? So even paying attention to that nuance in language and how faith communities sanctify it, right? So the faith community says we're losing our country. You know, now there's no such thing as binary marriages. Now it's queer. You know, we can't do conversion therapy, right? There's a huge movement in many Latin American countries, in Puerto Rico, to allow for people to do like therapeutic torture. We're seeing the fight against abortion rights, right? That's led by the religious right. And in many ways, they're becoming more ascendant and boldened. I mean, they took over the judiciary. All those Trump appointees, you know, they believe in dominionism. They believe in being able to expand and the right to self-defense more than anything. Which, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And obviously, they forget that part of their scriptures. And that's why they are all gunned up. And it's very concerning to see that. And
Jonathan, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there's a last question, and it's directed at you too. So maybe you can fold it into your comments as we come to an end.
Sure. So what should be the role of faith-based organizations within our Latinx communities to ensure we have an anti-racist dialogue? Since I believe they are complicit and part of the problem. Absolutely. In a lot of Latinx communities, they have white settler colonial ideology. For example, they look at scripture and say, oh, there's in Genesis the narrative of the sons of Ham, right? The people from the Abrahamic lineage that became the people of the Middle East, and they use that as a justification to take away Palestinian land. Like those ideologies, those narratives, those myths were part of really American, like especially religious discourse in this country. And we see how time and time again, Latinx communities have been taught to hate themselves and love their oppressors. It's a function of colonialism. So people that are colonized, they deputize in the religious space, also in the political space. We see in Latin American countries, right? The same way there's a missionizing role of colonization to make you love your master and hate your neighbor. We also see that with religion. We see that with the military. And I think one of the things to do is we need to break the hegemony, break the monotheistic preference of our religious tradition. See that a lot of in our Latinx communities, if we look, a lot of our religions are African-based, right? If we see that our country owes its expansion, whether intentionally or not, to a revolution that happened in Haiti that allowed for the creation, and voodoo played a very powerful role in liberation revolutionary movements. People very ignorant of that. You know, how a lot of the Sandinistas in Latin America, the liberation theologies, that movement is very real. So I think it's a lack of literacy, and as Rosa mentioned, popular education and political education play key roles in us rediscovering how there have been, you know, faith and spiritual movements. You know, if you're not into that thing, you know, I do think that the idea of just love, right, and spirituality, reintroducing those concepts, but not a soft love, not a love that is just passive, but a love that's active, that stands for justice. And we need to introduce that dialogue into faith traditions.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all for answering the call. When I get hysterical and I need advice and I need direction, you all are there for me. So this is so important to have love, right? To have people who radically love me. So thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Lubumba, Rosa. Thank you, Carl. And I'm sorry that Esmeralda wasn't able to join us because of the technical difficulties, but we will continue this conversation, I'm sure. So love you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you all. Bye.